Trying to find a tight end right now for your fantasy team is absolutely miserable, but if you're having difficulties figuring out who to start every week, you're not the only owner out there. So let's talk about how bad the tight ends have been and where the position is moving forward in 2024. Yo, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Today's video is going to get started with a few interesting facts about the tight end position. And then we're going to talk about where the position is going to be heading for the rest of the season and what you need to be doing in your lineups to hopefully be successful. How about the fact that Isaiah Likely, who's only scored 4.5 fantasy points the last 2 weeks combined, is still the tight end 4 on the season? Or the fact that George Kittle didn't play at all in week 3 and is still the tight end 6. The craziest stat might be Hunter Henry. He's put together 2 weeks of 2.8 fantasy points and 1.9 fantasy points, and he's still the tight end 9. Or maybe it's Brenton Strange, who put up a goose egg in week 1 and is the tight end 12 on the season. So far this season, 13 tight ends have been able to find the end zone, but there has been no tight ends that have multiple scores in 2024 yet. Through the first 3 weeks of the 2023 season, 16 tight ends had found the end zone, and 5 of them had multiple touchdowns already. In fact, Darnold Parham had 3 touchdowns in the first 3 weeks. The tight end position is an absolute mess right now. Only 8 tight ends have totaled 20 fantasy points over the first 3 weeks. Only 1 tight end has surpassed 30 fantasy points, and that's Dallas Goedert, who had 22 fantasy points in week 3. He's now the tight end 1 on the season. The biggest mistake that we can make with the tight end position the rest of the season is chasing snaps. We need to be looking at the tight ends who are getting the most targets. I see a lot of times in the comments that people are asking about tight ends that are playing on the field more times than not, or have a high snap percentage. But unfortunately, right now, we're seeing a lot of 12 personnel, where teams are designing the run scheme to have 2 tight ends on the field to help block. So with the tight end position, just because you're on the field doesn't mean you have a fantasy viable opportunity. You're just out there to block. You're not running routes. And while it may be really hard to bank on any tight end for your fantasy lineup right now, there could be a great opportunity later in the week to find some really low lines and be able to put those in some tickets over on Underdog. And the only way that you can take advantage of this is by heading over to Underdog right now, signing up using code word headliners and making at least a $10 deposit. You're going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, which we need right now based on the tight end position. But you also could get a deposit bonus of up to $1,000. And they have a ton of specials running this week that you won't want to miss out on. So make sure that you're checking out all of the pick'ems that we're talking about in our start and sit shows this week, and some of the discounts that could be available to you at the tight end position later in the week. And let's go ahead and absolutely take advantage of those. Thursday Night Football could end up bringing us one of the better tight ends of the week with Jake Ferguson, but on the Giant side of the ball, I don't know if we can rely on Theo Johnson. Jake Ferguson had a team-high 11 targets last week, and he may not be the main target every single week because CeeDee Lamb will probably take that opportunity more times than not, but if he can be at least the number 2 target and give us 8 to 11 targets per week, we're looking at a guy that has the best shot to be the tight end 1 every single week. Jake Ferguson, now that he's healthy, needs to be in your lineup all the time. The one thing we just have to hope for is that last season we saw inconsistent usage with Jake Ferguson, where he would see 11 targets and then he would disappear from the game plan for a couple of weeks. As long as Dallas doesn't screw that up, he's a great option. The tight end is really not being utilized in the Giants offense right now. Really the only thing we can bank on is Daniel Jones giving targets to Malik Nabers and Wan'Dale Robinson. After that, it's a hodgepodge of several different wide receivers and then the rotating tight ends for the Giants. So from a fantasy standpoint, we can't bank on Theo Johnson right now, but maybe at some point this season, he does get more involved. Taysom Hill had a couple of bum performances to start the season, and then he didn't even play in week 3, so we will continue to monitor his health moving forward. We thought we saw a little glimmer of hope with Foster Moreau, who saw some decent targets in week 1 and was being utilized pretty heavily as the tight end 1 in this offense. But unfortunately, since then, it's been a whole lot of nothing. So for right now, Foster Moreau definitely isn't worth a possibility. And I mean, if Taysom Hill is healthy, you can keep running him out there with the risk that he's going to give you absolutely nothing or he's going to blow up. And with the way the tight end position is right now, he could be the tight end one overall. On the season, New Orleans has allowed the 3rd most receiving yards and the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position. So this is a great opportunity for Kyle Pitts. But only 5 targets last week, and he only caught 2 of those, is still raising a major concern about consistency that he has lacked since coming into the league. I thought Kirk Cousins was going to be looking his way a lot more often, and his fantasy day could have been a whole lot better, but unfortunately, he wasn't able to come down with a target in the end zone. It may have been really close to pass interference. It wasn't called, but it doesn't matter. He didn't come down with it, and those points aren't there. When it comes to Kyle Pitts, there's not going to be a whole lot of better options out there. He's definitely one of the main route runners in this offense. We just need to start getting more targets. And if we can do that, then Kyle Pitts can be fantasy viable given the current landscape. After a promising week 1 for Colby Parkinson, he really hasn't been looked at a whole lot since. I mean, if your goal is 3 to 4 fantasy points for your tight end, which honestly isn't all that awful right now, then Colby Parkinson may be your guy. But I think it's just a little disappointing that with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua both missing, that Parkinson hasn't been more utilized in the offense. Let's take some time to dive into Cole Kmet a little bit more right now, because this is a great matchup against the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams are currently allowing the 4th most receiving yards and the 3rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. And Cole Kmet finally got bumped above Gerald Everett this past week, which I was really questioning why the Chicago Bears thought it was even remotely sensible to put Gerald Everett over Cole Kmet to begin the season. Cole Kmet finally outsnapped Everett. He ran more routes than Gerald Everett. He straight up outperformed Gerald Everett. And I know that he could. It was Gerald Everett that was kind of given the lead role by this coaching staff basically right away in the preseason. But Cole Kmet has hung around, and when he got his opportunity, he definitely delivered. And the hope is that he can continue to deliver the rest of the season. Now, Cole Kmet has top 12 upside this week, but there's a couple of things that will be dependent on him actually being able to reach that ceiling. And the first is Keenan Allen. When does he end up returning? If it is this week, it could severely cut in to whatever Cole Kmet saw happening last week. Now, DJ Moore also kind of banged up his knee a little bit. I think he's going to be just fine. There should be no issues that we need to worry about. So Keenan Allen is the biggest threat to Cole Kmet. But it's also potential positive or neutral game script, and it also depends on how well they can run the football. If the Chicago Bears stay positive or neutral against the LA Rams, and they can run the football, which they haven't been able to do all season, that's going to hurt the potential targets. But if it's positive or neutral and they still can't run the football, they're still going to be passing it 35, 40 times this week, which still leaves plenty of opportunities for Cole Kmet to reach that upside. The Green Bay Packers currently allow the 6th most fantasy points and the 9th most receiving yards to the tight end position. So does Johnny Mundt have a shot this week? Absolutely he does, but he only had 3 targets last week, and without Jordan Addison, my hope is that he would have been utilized a little bit more. This matchup does give him some potential, and basically everyone at the tight end position is risky right now, so if you want to risk it with Johnny Mundt this week and you don't have another option that has a safer floor, then by all means, go ahead and give it a shot. But if for some reason Jordan Addison does end up returning this week, I'm probably passing on Johnny Mundt with the way Jalen Naylor has been playing, because those two could end up being the 1 and 2 options behind Justin Jefferson, and Mundt may not get looks at all. Tucker Kraft's usage still continues to heavily outweigh Luke Musgrave. He's running more routes and he's seeing more snaps. But like we talked about at the beginning of the video, just because you have a bunch of snaps doesn't mean you're being utilized, because neither of these guys are getting targets when they're on the field. With Jordan Love back, maybe we get to see Tucker Kraft going here fairly shortly. But honestly, I think it's going to take an injury at the wide receiver position because of how they rotate those guys for Tucker Kraft to become fantasy viable again. The Indianapolis Colts are allowing the 7th most fantasy points to the tight end position currently, so maybe it's finally Pat Freiermuth week. After 5 targets last week, he's up to 2nd on the team in targets, but not really a ton of usage based on the current offensive scheme being ran with Justin Fields at quarterback. So unfortunately, he doesn't have a really high ceiling. His floor is not all that bad. If he continues to see 5 targets, he should score right around 4 to 5 fantasy points. If there was ever a week for him to find a little bit more of a ceiling, though, it would have to be in this matchup against Indianapolis, especially if the running backs end up being banged up and they pass it a little bit more than what we had previously thought. For the Colts, Kylen Granson is still number one on the depth chart. He's still seeing the most routes run, and he's still seeing the most snaps played. But that's not really translating to a whole lot. 1 target, 1 reception, 40 yards. That's awesome. If I could see a couple plays like that every single week, he would definitely be fantasy viable. But only 1 target is not going to cut it, and he's rotating with 2 other tight ends right now. Greg Dulcich fell all the way down to tight end 3 basically in terms of usage this past week for the Broncos. Adam Troutman appears to be the tight end 1 now, and maybe Dulcich was dropped down because of his issues with drops. But it's really crazy to look at the tight end position and wonder how it's not being utilized more given the current game plan for the Denver Broncos. They're really relying on the short, quick passes, which is what Bo Nix did and did well in college. He's not a guy that stands in the pocket well and drives the ball down the field. He'll toss a few up every once in a while, but that's not really the game plan for the Denver Broncos right now. So why are we not utilizing the tight end position more? Continue to monitor this, and maybe they start doing it more often here, but unfortunately at this point, there's not really any fantasy upside or even stability in the tight end position, let alone anything else in this offense. I know Tyler Conklin is going to be a really popular name, especially on the waiver wire over the next couple of weeks. And as waiver wires begin to process when this video comes out and even after it, just be very cautious of what we saw from Tyler Conklin this past week, because it wasn't an upgrade in usage or anything like that, because he was actually on the field the least amount during a game that he has been all season as of yet. The only difference was this week is he just saw more targets. Is that something that continues? If his usage is going down and he's not on the field nearly as much, that's a dangerous game to be playing, hoping that he gets those type of targets every single week. The one thing that gives me a little bit of hope this week is the fact that the outside matchups are going to be tough. And if that happens, Aaron Rodgers looks to the inside for Tyler Conklin a little bit more often. I just think he has a wide range of outcomes this week. His ceiling could be exactly what we saw last week, but unfortunately his floor could be one that maybe he's a top 15, top 20 tight end at best. Philadelphia and Tampa Bay is going to bring me to my Manscaped must-start tight end of the week, and it's going to be Dallas Goedert, who's coming off of a huge 22-point game last week. In fact, that game was so huge, it bumped him all the way up to tight end 1 on the season. And now he's the only tight end in the NFL to surpass 30 fantasy points total for the season. And just like I need to have Dallas Goedert in my starting lineup, I need to have Manscaped in my starting lineup, because they have all the tools that you need, especially with the holiday season coming up. If you need to get a gift for someone special and maybe, give them a little bit of a hint, head on over to manscaped.com and use code word headliners20. You're going to get 20% off of your entire order and free shipping. And they've got some new awesome tools that you don't want to miss out on. Now, Tampa Bay has only allowed 60 receiving yards to tight ends so far this season, but there is a good opportunity for Dallas Goedert to be the main and potentially only pass catching weapon this week. Devontae Smith went into the concussion protocol late in that game last week. Who knows if he clears? If he does, awesome, he'll be out on the field. But if he doesn't, he's going to get an extra week's rest. And that's why A.J. Brown may not play either. Philadelphia will head into their bye for week 5. And because of that, it could give Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown an extra week's worth of rest and the ability to come back even stronger in week 6. That's why it wouldn't shock me if both Smith and Brown are out. And if they are, Dallas Goedert could see just as many targets as he did last week. And just like I said at the start of the video, we need to chase targets and opportunity at the tight end position. And there may be nobody better with that opportunity than Dallas Goedert in week 4. Cade Otton had one of those pop-up games last week. Every once in a while, he gets a few extra targets, and because of that, he makes his way towards the top 12 of tight ends. But it's not something that typically stays consistent. And one of the main reasons we probably saw it last week is because of the tough matchup for Mike Evans on the outside. This matchup for these guys is going to be a little bit easier than what we saw. Mike Evans could definitely get back on track, and Chris Godwin should still be safe this week. So Cade Otton, for me, is definitely going to be one that I'm avoiding. The San Francisco 49ers have only allowed 39 receiving yards to the tight end position, 4th lowest in the NFL. I don't know if this is going to be the game for Hunter Henry to get back on track. And last week was a good matchup for Hunter Henry to be utilized a little bit better, but he only saw 3 targets, and that continues to be the biggest issue with Hunter Henry in New England. He'll have a game or two where it looks like, hey, he's on the right track, he's going to be the main target, and then all of a sudden he disappears for a couple of games at a time, and I don't know why New England continues to do that. I would love to see some more consistent presence from him in the game plan, but really until that happens, if you're starting Hunter Henry, you're going to continue to be taking a big risk every week. But his counterpart in this matchup, if he can get healthy, George Kittle has a great matchup. New England allowing the 6th most receiving yards to tight ends right now. Unfortunately, George Kittle missed last week, but if he's able to make it back healthy this week, then we should be all go to have him as a really safe start for us. The biggest issue would be if he's limited at all, but Deebo Samuel likely out again, and of course Christian McCaffrey will not be in again. George Kittle should end up being the number 2 target on this offense. Juwan Jennings had a great week last week, but George Kittle likely gets back to being the second option behind Brandon Ayuk, and Jennings falls back to number 3. If there were a week for David Njoku to get healthy and come back, it would be this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, who currently allow the 7th most receiving yards to the tight end position. But unfortunately, on Monday, when asked about David Njoku and if he was going to be ready for week 4, Kevin Stefanski only replied with, "We'll see." Unfortunately, that means David Njoku is going to be a high risk until we know more later on in the week. Continue to monitor this. If David Njoku ends up playing, he goes to a mid-risk for me. It's a great matchup, but there's always an opportunity for re-aggravation, or maybe he ends up being a little bit limited and Cleveland just doesn't let on to that. Unfortunately, Brock Bowers, who was in a really good position last week, did not return value. His first down performance of the season. And it was really weird because Michael Mayer saw a huge uptick in usage. Some of that may have been due to the negative game script, and maybe just taking Bowers off the field and giving Michael Mayer a little bit of work was a part of that game plan once Las Vegas found themselves down. But hopefully that doesn't happen too often. Even if Las Vegas is playing from a negative game script, which with their defense, it could end up happening more times than not, Brock Bowers continues to stay out on the field, and we don't see Michael Mayer coming on more and more often. I know you want to keep Brock Bowers healthy, but from a fantasy standpoint, if we're seeing Las Vegas down by 2 or 3 scores throughout the game, that could really end up killing Brock Bowers this season. For the first time in as long as I can remember, Travis Kelce becomes a mid-range risk start for me. If you own him, you spent too high on draft capital and you don't have any better options. For as bad as Travis Kelce has been to begin the season, is there really anybody performing all that much better that you may have? Now, if you do, great. Play him over Travis Kelce, keep him on your bench. But if you don't, we need to hope that him and Patrick Mahomes get on the same page, because they just don't feel on the same page right now. In their week 2 matchup, Patrick Mahomes missed a couple of plays with Travis Kelce that honestly could have made a huge fantasy day, especially a touchdown that was batted down at the offensive line that definitely would have given Travis Kelce a top 10 performance. And I know patience is wearing thin with Travis Kelce, but what else can we do? Do we really think that he's going to be one of the worst tight ends in all of football this year? I feel like at some point these guys are going to get going, and then Travis Kelce will end up being just fine. I feel like I'm going to get a ton of questions about the Chargers tight ends this week, which makes sense. The Chiefs are currently allowing the most fantasy points and the most receiving yards to the tight end position. But the question for Los Angeles is who? Because Hayden Hurst and Will Dissly see the same amount of snaps. They're split 50-50. And because of that, it's going to be really hard to try and figure out who's going to be the guy. Now, if you need me to throw a dart for you, if you need somebody from this matchup because it is such a good opportunity, I'll go ahead and throw the dart at Hayden Hurst, because even though the snaps are very similar, Hayden Hurst ran more routes last week. Hayden Hurst ran 18 routes in week 3. Will Dissly only ran 8 routes. So if I'm going to have to pick anybody here, I'll go with Hayden Hurst. If he runs more routes, it's going to give him more of an opportunity, especially considering the fact that there is a real possibility that Justin Herbert is out this week and we see a backup quarterback. Sometimes when those things happen, we see some of those dump-off passes go to the tight end, and maybe Hayden Hurst gets it figured out to help fantasy owners. But when I talk about this being a dart throw, I mean we're throwing a dart and we're trying to hit a bullseye from the 10-yard line to the other end of the field in the end zone. Even with T. Higgins back last week, Mike Gesicki still saw a pretty decent fantasy day. But the question is, what if Cincinnati isn't passing all day long the way that they had to against Washington? Carolina is the only team that's allowed multiple touchdowns to the tight end position so far this season. So Mike Gesicki finding the end zone is not out of the question. But you have Jamar Chase as the number 1, you have T. Higgins as the number 2, and even Iosivas is still being utilized pretty heavily right now. So where does Mike Gesicki fall into the mix? If Carolina comes out and the Red Rifle is gunning it all over the place, we might be good with a neutral game script, and we might be passing it as Cincinnati's offense. But if Cincinnati starts to blow out Carolina and it doesn't end up being a neutral game script, then unfortunately that's going to hurt Mike Gesicki. And that's the biggest concern for him this week, is how much work does Iosivas see and what is the game script? A lot of people are going to start Mike Gesicki this week, and I get it. His ceiling is a top 12 tight end. His floor, though, is unstartable. And for Carolina, Tommy Tremble is back up at the top of the depth chart for the tight end position after being banged up the first couple of weeks. But at this point, they're rotating their guys at the tight end position, and they're not being looked at because the other wide receivers are being utilized more. Now, Adam Thielen being hurt, maybe that helps a little bit. Maybe Tommy Tremble does get a few extra looks this week, but it's not something I'm willing to bank on right now. For Evan Ingram in Jacksonville, all we can do is continue to monitor his health status. When he comes back, he's definitely a startable tight end, and we'll jump back into having top 12 upside every single week. Brenton Strange is going to be a very popular streaming option, though. He was last week, and if it weren't for that touchdown, it would have been really bad. But he ended up getting the touchdown, and he had 65 yards a couple of weeks ago. In a matchup where Jacksonville could potentially be playing from behind quite a bit again, going up against Houston, Brenton Strange is definitely another one to be keeping an eye on. But we cannot start him if Evan Ingram even plays, even if it's just a little bit. Even in an extremely negative game script this past week, Dalton Schultz still only saw 5 targets, and he had a pretty awful drop on top of it. Right now, it's definitely Nico Collins, and then it's Stephon Diggs, and then it's Tank Dell. And if Joe Mixon is healthy, they're going to be running the football. Dalton Schultz just has no value right now. Maybe he'll find himself a decent day every once in a while, but unless there's an injury to the wide receivers, Dalton Schultz just doesn't stand a chance. Zach Ertz is not going to have a ton of upside every single week, but he's going to have a super solid floor, like 68 fantasy points per week. You may not do much worse at the tight end position right now. And the fact that Washington's defense is just utter garbage is great for negative game script and great for his ability. Now, the big plays are going to go to the wide receivers. But if Zach Ertz can get a 6 to 8 points weekly, he's going to be a top 10 option almost all season long. And one of the better tight ends that you can start knowing that, hey, I know he's not going to get me a 0, even if he's not going to win the week for me. Unfortunately, Trey McBride is in the concussion protocol, and one of the most reliable tight ends that we can trust may not be available to us in week 4. Now, the brunt of the hit that caused the concussion really fell on Brian Branch, so Trey McBride has a good shot to still clear this week, and if he does, we're automatically starting him. Even if the numbers show that Washington has done a pretty decent job at stopping tight ends, we still play Trey McBride no matter what. Well, hey there, Dalton Kincaid. It's nice to see you. Welcome to the 2024 fantasy season. Fantasy owners have been waiting a little bit for you to show up, but now that you're here, feel free to stay as long as you would like because you're welcome in for the rest of the season at this point. We need you to score. Now, this matchup against Baltimore is good in terms of yards allowed, but Baltimore is one of the teams that have not allowed a touchdown to the tight end position. My only worry with Dalton Kincaid this week is that the wide receivers see a majority of the targets. Baltimore has been awful against wide receivers. Dalton Kincaid should still have a really good week, and hopefully if Baltimore can keep this score close, both of these teams keep passing, and Buffalo doesn't send all their starters to the bench in the second half for the third straight week. Now, Mark Andrews owners are in an extreme panic right now, and it makes sense. Was nowhere to be found to begin the season, thought we may start to get him back after week 2, completely disappeared again in week 3. But part of the problem with Mark Andrews disappearing this week was the game script, because essentially Baltimore was winning the entire game and it wasn't close until the fourth quarter. So at that point, Baltimore really had started taking starters off the field, had stopped passing the ball, and was really just running it. Then all of a sudden Dallas started to come back and Baltimore still squeaked it out after giving up 19 points in the fourth quarter. That's how big the lead was. Baltimore didn't score anything in the fourth quarter. They gave up 19 points and they still won. Now, Isaiah Likely is still running more routes than what Mark Andrews is, but really for Mark Andrews to have fantasy value, we need to have the games close. If it gets too far out of hand like it did for Baltimore and Dallas this past week, he may end up coming off the field so they can keep him healthy because injuries continue to pile up for him. Isaiah Likely probably for now is the best bet if you need to pick either of these tight ends, and this is going to be a tougher matchup on the outside for wide receiver, so hopefully Likely and or Andrews can help you out this week. For Tennessee, you really got to hope that one of these tight ends start to stand out. They're seeing a pretty fair rotation within the offense right now. Okonkwo is seeing the most snaps, Weil saw the most yards this past week, and Vannett scored the touchdown. But if that's the case, that's not going to help us because trying to figure out who it is on a weekly basis is going to be super tough. As of right now, just continue to keep an eye on the Titans tight ends, and hopefully at some point someone steps up, becomes fantasy viable, we can grab them off the waivers and start putting them in our lineup a little bit more often. Everything last week was set up perfect for Jonnu Smith to have a fantasy viable day. Skylar Thompson, the backup quarterback, was going to be in, and the hope was he would look towards Smith a little bit more often. But then Smith only ran a route on 43% of Miami's offensive plays. That is disastrous, and he only saw 3 targets. As much as I want Jonnu Smith to be a thing, and as much as he really should be a thing in this offense, he just isn't right now. If you still keep trying to start him, I wouldn't. If he's still sitting on your roster, he's pretty close to just being droppable at this point. Noah Fant is coming off a pretty decent day for fantasy owners last week if you decided to try and run him out there. But this week, I don't know if that's going to happen against the Detroit Lions. The wide receivers are going to be the star in this matchup going up against that secondary. But the biggest thing is Pharaoh Brown, because Pharaoh Brown is being utilized more as a blocking tight end than what Noah Fant is. And given the fact that Aiden Hutchinson has 6.5 sacks through 3 games already, means you got to find a way to slow him down. And by doing that, you can bring in that extra blocker on the edge with Pharaoh Brown at the tight end position, which could leave Noah Fant off the field a little bit more than we would like this week. Definitely going to go ahead and skip on Noah Fant in this matchup. Seattle has allowed the 5th most receiving yards to tight end so far this season, so this is a great opportunity for Sam Laporta, especially considering the fact that it is a really tough matchup for Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams in that secondary. The hope is that Sam Laporta is good to go right now, and that's why I have him listed as a high risk. It is an ankle sprain, and as of right now, there hasn't been a huge update as to whether or not he may be able to play this week. And there hasn't been much of an update to his practice report as of yet. We will continue to monitor it. For a low ankle sprain, you can tape it and you can typically go out there. And we know that he can play through pain. He did last year at the end of the season and into the playoffs after injuring his knee. So for Sam Laporta, I know that he has a chance to be out there. But until we hear it, he's going to be a high risk. And then he's going to move to medium risk even in a really good matchup this week because there's always that chance of re-aggravating the injury. Yo, Headliner Nation, hopefully you enjoyed this analysis of the tight end position. I know it is tough out there right now, but keep the faith, ladies and gentlemen, and let's hope that at some point in time, these tight ends start to pick it up and we start finding a few guys that we can rely on a weekly basis. For now, though, I'm going to go ahead and head on out of here. I got to go record wide receivers for you all. So have a great day, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch everybody on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.